Hi, welcome to our Christian Concepts channel where we present the Sunday School lesson each week. I'm your host, Dr. Christie Solomon. Well, this week our lesson is entitled God Promises Light, and our focus is in the Old Testament book of Isaiah chapter 58, verses 6 through 10. And what we want to do is present a couple of points here as we go through these 5 scripture verses and see how God has left the word for the people during Isaiah's time, Prophet Isaiah's time, as well as it is for us today. So there are 3 goals that we hope that will be applicable to you in some way. Number 1, we're trusting that as you go through your study, you will be able to identify the who, the what, the when, the where, and the why of this lesson. As always, when you finish, you should know what has God shared with you. Number 2, you should be able to identify what results are shared when the scripture refers to light breaking forth. That light breaking forth. And hopefully you get to the point of knowing this has something to do with comprehension and commitment for yourself. And then 3, one of the goals here that we're hoping that you'll be able to do is to explain the context of the 3 undesirable actions that are mentioned in this chapter, and that's in verse 9, part B. What's undesirable for those people, those biblical people, those Hebrew Jewish people then and still today? Those are your 3 goals for you. And so now let us present our lesson outline. This week's lesson is broken down into 2 sections, if you will. Section 1, we'd like for you to focus on God's chosen fast, and that's shared in verses 6 and 7. And the second section is focused in a bright future, and that's covering the last 3 verses, 8, 9, and 10. So section 1, God's chosen fast, part A is shared in verse 6. Break every yoke. And I'm telling you, we allow ourselves to be oppressed in so many ways from society and from our own desires. And God is sharing that we should break every yoke. And then in verse 7, we read how that's the need that we have in place of this yoke is going to be provided by God himself. So he provides for any and every need. I tell you, that's shouting time right there. As we move on to section 2 of our study this week, it could be focused in a bright future, and that's covering verses 8, 9, and 10. And then again, in verse 8 and verse 8, 9a, we read of God's protection. As we go forward, we see in verses 9b and verse 10, God gives his promise. Those are the 2 sections for this lesson of our Sunday School. During this week, our study gives you a couple of questions that should bring to some deep thought for yourself to answer for your commitment and your purpose. And one is, why are you fasting? Surely in these 5 verses, you'll see what God has shared about fasting and what Isaiah is telling the people about how it appears some people's practice of fasting. That gives you the point of reflection. Why are you fasting? Keep that in mind as you're reading these scriptures. And we're going to give you a bit of context historically so you can see what was going on again at this time for the people of Israel. So for our lesson context, I hope you remember that this really is our 3rd lesson from the book of Isaiah. So the contextual conditions are still applicable, still going on for the people of Jerusalem at that time. But here in chapter 58, Isaiah is focusing on fasting, and he's giving clarity on what fasting is from God's perspective, and possibly how it is not necessarily seen or practiced or demonstrated in the way some of the people were sharing at that time. I do want you to know, and I'm praying that you have embraced the essence of fasting. And the essence of fasting really is self-denial. Yeah, you do remove yourself from some things you're participating in. The intent behind this practice is typically understood as being reminded of complete dependence on the Lord. And Jesus shared that in Matthew chapter 4 and is repeated again of this intent in Luke chapter 12. So, fasting on a regular and religious basis could earn the respect of the community. And that is seen in the Old Testament. Some of the people were fasting in the community, and everybody knew that. And you could see that reported in 1 Samuel, in the book of Esther, in the book of Joel, and even 1 Kings. Additionally, fasting could be an appropriate personal condition for your dedicated time of prayer. Again, you can read of that in 2 Samuel, in Nehemiah, even in Daniel, because it definitely brings a humbleness for you and your spirituality, your soul, and that's shared in the book of Psalms. However, and conversely, on the other side, fasting could easily become an empty ritual just for an announcement's sake, for someone to think of you as more spiritual than you are. Yeah, unfortunately, that does happen. And it becomes one to acknowledge your piety or your religiosity, rather than it is a spiritual discipline to remove yourself from the drawings of the earthly desires, shared in Zechariah, shared in Matthew, and as well as in Luke. So in this chapter 58, Prophet Isaiah loudly declares the rebellion and the hypocrisy of Israel. And that's in the earlier verses of this chapter, verses 1 and 2. Yeah. So the people here are invited to critique themselves as they are pointing to the fast that they say they do. And they have been doing this, and they're presenting this as if it's evidence of their own humility. But it just brings attention by God, for God to clarify some things, like, let me share some things with you. Have you ever had moments where God had to clarify some things for you? And here God points out that what should have been really the obvious error in their way, fasting only gave the appearance of humility for the people, but it actually resulted in showing how they are using that in exploitation and in violence. And he says in verse 5, is that what you call a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? And of course the answer would be no. Back to that question that I asked you earlier. What and why are you fasting? So in these 5 verses, as we read, let's see what God has shared through his prophet Isaiah on what people were doing there back in the biblical times of his ministry, as well as what's going on today. Verse 6, is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen, to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? And I am reading through the NIV. Verse 7, is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter, when you see the naked to clothe them, and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Verse 8, then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Verse 9, then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, here am I. If you do away with the yoke of oppression with the pointing finger and malicious talk. And if you spend yourselves in behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, I'm in verse 10, then your light will rise in the darkness and your night will become like the noonday. And this addresses verses 6 through 10. God promises light of chapter 58. Yeah, I shared earlier that I wanted you to reflect on some questions that you might be able to find some solution or resource as you contemplate how it affects you. Because you do know, and I'm praying that you do agree, you're not in this world by yourself. And whether you think something affects someone else or that you're doing your own thing and it just you enjoying yourself, we as humans are always affected in this community called human race. So the second question I want to bring to your attention is, how can you identify oppression in your community? Yeah. For you, what resources are available for you to identify this oppression and then discover who to learn from and work with to address the problem? Yeah, that's for you. Question number 3. What resources do you currently devote to caring for impoverished people? Yeah, this question is for you. Considering that this care is one way of expressing devotion to God, are there any other resources you would consider devoting to aid the poor? Yeah. And then, question number 4. In what ways can you expect the blessings of Isaiah chapter 58 verses 8 and 9a to come about as consequence of righteousness that is seen in action? Question 5. Which if statement of Isaiah chapter 58 verse 9b through 10 is more compelling to you? Why is that so? And the last question, what or which concept in today's lesson do you find most challenging? And if you find one most challenging, I guess this is my last question for real. Which concept do you find most or more encouraging? Listen, we have learned that in coming up with some thoughts and some solutions that we may say could help us in providing for our community, that God has done many things in our lives. We've blessed us with abundance in so many ways. So it definitely takes a minute or two for us to reflect on what we can do. Let's remember that the prophet Isaiah pushed Israel to understand that what God deems important is not a temporary willingness to fast from food, but it is in fact a spiritual health check that leads to our righteous behavior. So we may ask ourselves those questions. Do I go through ritualistic motions on a regular basis instead of allowing my heart to really be turned toward God during those spiritual practices of fasting? A just and caring community will consider the hungry in all aspects that Prophet Isaiah has already defined, which is in food, clothing, and housing, shared in verse 7. We wonder, how can we feel comfortable in our abundance if we really know there is suffering in our neighborhoods? Yeah, it may be impossible for any one individual to meet every community need, but this does not excuse us, you or I, from keeping our eyes open to the plight of others or striving to meet the needs that we see on a daily basis. Listen, I know that God has spoken to you and that you have been giving to the community in the ways that God has blessed you to do so. And we just want to make sure that we appreciate you. And whether we see you, whether we are a recipient or not, we just thank God that He has shared with you and placed it in your spirit and your heart to do so. And for that, can we just complete the questions in our goal number one for this lesson. We just want to call it just the facts. So you should know by now that the who part of this lesson is, again, what Prophet Isaiah is saying, according to what God has told him to, for the people of Israel. What is he saying? Well, Prophet Isaiah is addressing the people about fasting, the proper way, and what's being neglected. When is this happening? Prophet Isaiah ministered between 740 BC and 680 BC. Again, where is it taking place? In Jerusalem, Israel, and the regions around it. Why is this happening in this lesson? Well, God has directed Prophet Isaiah, as you have read, to remind the people of their obligation to the poor in the community. And this is written to illuminate the essence of fasting, which is self-denial, and not an opportunity to promote your self-piety, how you can brag about it to your friends and your coworkers. I trust that God has again spoken to you in a mighty way. I'm Dr. Christie. If you like us, why don't you give us a thumbs up, share this video with your friends and family, leave us a comment, and we'll be glad to respond to you, and consider subscribing. And until we study with you again next week, God's best for you.